is Sunday, December the 16th, 2018. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, François-Noël Babeuf, the world's first revolutionary communist, yes, so forward-thinking. He was a communist before Marx was even a twinkle in his father's eye. We will go through the story of the French Revolution as experienced through the eyes of François Babeuf. Before I get to that, just a brief reminder. This show is brought to you by people like you, people who go to paypal.me/distantpeasant or patreon.com/distantpeasant. Both links can be found at my website, distantpeasant.com, which is always headquarters. And thank you very much for your support. Happy holidays and a Merry Christmas. Thank God we can all say that phrase now. Merry Christmas. Feels good. But listen, all I'm getting as a present this year is an eviction notice from my landlord. So if you want to spread some Christmas cheer, you can do so up the websites that I mentioned before. And thank you very much to each and every one of the people who contribute to me. Couldn't do this without you. Okay, enough of all that. On with the show. Far back in the mists of time, all the way in 121 BCE, a man knelt to pray to an ancient god, determined to make a final sacrifice of his life, and only the manner of that life's end to be determined. He had spent his public career agitating for the rights of the common men of the Roman Republic and its surrounding Latin territories, even after watching his brother beaten to death for similar agitation by partisans of the oligarchic and patrician Senate. Years of duplicitous campaigns by his enemies to co-opt his reforms, to engineer election fraud against him, and to have him tried on sham charges, had finally given way to an open plot to murder him, an offer of amnesty to all who abandoned his popular cause. In a fit of passion, Gaius Gracchus prayed to the triple goddess Diane of the silver glade, of the moon-bathed wilderness, of the gloomy underworld, to enslave the people of Rome forever. For quickly and openly switching sides when this amnesty was declared, he then fled the temple, observed by many, none of whom would offer him any aid, and crossed a wooden bridge over the Tiber River. Two allies of his would stand at that bridge's mouth, killing as many of his pursuers as they could before they themselves were felled. Gaius himself would commit suicide with the help of a devoted slave beneath the boughs of a shady grove. 1,901 years later, in the year 1781 of the Common Era now, Claude Babeuf lied upon his deathbed, clutching a well-worn copy of Plutarch's Lives, which contains the story of the Gracchi brothers, with his son Francois close by his side. Quote, I could have wished to have resembled Gaius Gracchus, even though I were doomed to perish like him in his for the greatest of all causes, the cause of the common welfare. But circumstances have not been favorable to the accomplishment of my designs. Swear upon this sword that has never yet departed from the path of honor, never to abandon the interests of the people, which are everything, and to pour out, if need be, the last drop of your blood to enlighten and defend this downtrodden race. End quote. And the young François Babeuf did as his father bid. It's all a little too perfect to be totally true, I suspect. Plutarch, and indeed pretty much all ancient writers whose work has survived for us to read today, frequently invented speeches and details about their subjects in a way that modern historians would find deceptive and unprofessional. But as for events concerning the Babeufs, we have Francois' account at least, which I basically take at face value. If he was lying about it, you at least have to give him credit for commitment, as Francois would not just choose the name Gracchus in honor of these brothers, but their violent ends as well. And what is certainly true is that after that end, a utopian socialist from Britain named John Goodwin Barmby would meet with some of the posthumous Babeuf's disciples and name them communists in 1840. If not the first time the designation was applied in an English language context we might recognize, then certainly one of the first. Because it turns out the French feudal system was so Byzantine and arbitrary that for at least one of the people who greased its gears and kept it humming along, it was enough by itself to make him into the world's first revolutionary communist, a generation before Karl Marx was even born. He will watch the French Revolution spin totally out of control and come to rely upon a national directorate perched ever more narrowly upon the head of a pin, spinning round and round, whacking the right, then the left, then the right again, and on, in the name of public safety for its petite bourgeois state. All as the bars of Babeuf's own song, Mourant de Fame, Mourant de Freud, dying of hunger, dying of cold, floated through the air. François-Noël Babeuf was born the 23rd of November, 1760, in the peasant commune of Saint-Quentin, roughly 150 kilometers north by northeast of Paris. He was a sickly child who was for a long time not expected to make it. It may be that his mother suffered from poor circumstance common to peasants during the pregnancy, or any one of the many mysterious and cruel ailments which plagued humanity ununderstood for millennia. His father had obtained the rank of major in the Austrian army and tutored the children of Queen and Empress Maria Theresa before receiving amnesty in 1755. A man of decent learning, he taught his son the basics of French, Latin, and German, as well as mathematics, but was forced to support his family via what casual labor he could find, and died himself in 1781. Francois himself contended that it was the miserable existence a proud and capable man like his father was subjected to that first began to shape his political opinions. The younger Babeuf was now head of the family and provider for his mothers and sisters, as well as a wife, starting in 1782, and he provided for his family's livelihood as a clerk and land surveyor, before in 1783 he landed the big gig in the town of Rouen, Commissar à Terrier. Now, what the hell is a Commissar à Terrier, you may ask? Well, the job was so amorphous that it's pretty tough to tell exactly what his duties and responsibilities were. But the terrier, of which he was the commissaire, was the French version of the English Doomsday Book. That is, a comprehensive record of ownership, value, duties, obligations, liabilities, and exceptions of all the lands of the Holy Kingdom of France. Feudalism in France, having developed through the twists and turns of centuries of duchies fragmenting into ever smaller pieces, lesser lords endlessly usurping or privatizing the prerogatives of others, getting those usurpations recognized, then not, then recognized again, and vassals pledged to multiple lords in different and endlessly conflicted ways. This was the mess through which Babeuf tread. And though still a sort of domestic servant, Babeuf's highly visible remunerative job was to sort through this arbitrary and sloppy mess of what passed for law in France at the time, and at the end of it tell everyone who owed what, to whom, and why. Quote, "It was in the dust of the seigneurial archives that I discovered the frightful mysteries of the usurpations of the noble caste. He went on, quote, "The knowledge of feudal practices is the reason why I was perhaps the most formidable scourge of feudalism," end quote. Now, this being the age of enlightenment, and Babeuf now with clerks to employ and a certain amount of leisure time, he naturally engaged in correspondence with the Royal Academy at Arras on all manner of things. In March of 1787, 2 years before the start of the French Revolution, he tried to get a great new pamphlet printed and circulated to be read particularly by the man of Arras. This brochure, which he claimed was not written by him but by an acquaintance, severely criticizes the then French system of assigning all higher-level positions in the army to courtiers and aristocrats without any real military knowledge. It also advocates the establishment of a national assembly, which should serve as a court of final appeal for all the nation, including the king. In his correspondence, you could still smell the utopianism on him a bit. But as a much more American writer will put it years later, you can't depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus. Quote, "I would be greatly pleased to find myself no longer looked down upon by those who, because they are in professions that are considered here in France to be more distinguished, believe themselves authorized to pay attention to me only when they wish to appear to announce their protection. And for my part, it will not bother me in the slightest to treat as an equal the artisan who cuts my hair or who manufactures my shoes. This must come to be so, in fact. Are not artisans of this sort useful and necessary? If their taste or natural inclinations have led them to professions of this sort rather than to studying law, must they be viewed by society as individuals who are less interesting than those whose faculties or inclinations have led them to the magistrature? Not everyone can be a magistrate, and perhaps the person who has come to be one has suffered less than has some unfortunate laborer to whom nature was unkind in learning the simplest occupation. Is it this poor man's fault that he did not receive more fortunate propensities at birth? Must he enjoy fewer advantages just for this than would have been his lot if he had been capable of presiding over the government of the Republic? He has only learned to knit? All right then. He will make stockings for the farmers, for the cooks, for the wine growers, for the fabric makers, for the shoemakers, for the wig makers, for the masons, for the men of law, etc. And these men will in turn procure for him bread, good food, wine, clothing, shoes, headdress, lodging, and the general preservation of all of his rights. There will be the same reciprocity through all the levels of society, and I hope that in this way everyone will be perfectly satisfied. Several years ago, someone wrote against the excesses of luxury that were beginning to be apparent. He complained that the various ranks of society were becoming confused, that it was no longer possible to distinguish by the style of dress a great lord from an ordinary person, and he proposed, in order to put a stop to this supposed abuse, that a distinctive emblem be established that would become part of the dress and would be expressive and even explicative of each social rank. So that, for example, the nobleman would wear a representation of a sword, the grocer one of a loaf of bread, the salad oil merchant a keg of anchovies, the poulterer a goose, the blacksmith an anvil, the tailor a pair of scissors, etc. I hope that when our new republic is established, people will not bother themselves with such questions, since all useful functions in society, and there will certainly no longer be any but useful functions, will be equally honorable. End quote. I will now reveal a contradiction I wrestle with, maybe one you too have wrestled with. Of course, the tides of history sweep us all along, it's true. One way to look at history is the story of forces larger than any one or few of us driving change. Material conditions are more important than morality or ethics in understanding what makes kings and governments rise and fall. But these material conditions can be thought of as the sort of straw that humanity casts about itself, building over time, mostly unrecognized, into the kindling for a forge fire. And like every fire, it needs a spark. An illusion or not, free will is a concept worth indulging. And Babeuf's spark on the eve of the French Revolution was no bound tome by a bearded intellectual, nor the decree of any king, nor the sweep of any army, or the famine from a bad harvest. No. It was some asshole not paying his bills. In 1788, the Marquis de Soicourt was in trouble, having exhausted his resources by bumming around the court at Versailles and with the not uncommon aristocratic habit of not paying anyone what he owed them. The Marquis employed Babeuf to please help him sort this all out, who was at this time at the height of his reputation and popularity as a land agent, businessman, and expert in all the rights and privileges of the French feudal system. Babeuf duly went into the archives of the Marquis and spent 6 months doing important cataloging, exhaustively detailing the possessions, rights, and incomes due the Marquis. And when his bill for this work was presented at 12,000 livres, he was forced to accept the equivalent of 200. Babeuf was furious and ruined, having refused several offers of work in the preceding months, and was while still seething from this and the many resentments cultivated by his contact with the aristocrats of the Ancien Regime, that the Estates General of France was convened for the first time in over a century, May 1789, the traditional start to the French Revolution. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to retell the entire story of the French Revolution, which you will recall Thomas Paine was bizarrely fortunate enough to live through, but we will hit some highlights. Of course, as soon as convened, grievances flooded the Estates General from all kinds of people, great and small, including Babeuf, who immediately set his entire professional reputation on fire by penning an article proposing the abolition of all feudal tenure and the substitution of a single nationwide tax. Details are scarce, but he may have also taken part in the hot new trend sweeping France at the time of burning all the feudal records you could find. Later, when the Bastille fell in July of 1789, he was present there, and his work as a feudal land agent was beginning to become entirely scarce, both due to reputation and circumstance in France. He spent the rest of 89 and most of 90 writing and drawing up various petitions, before beginning a habit of landing in legal trouble for his agitations. He was accused of unauthorized printing and distribution of a pamphlet on taxation according to means, using the city's resources, and of urging wine shopkeepers to resist taxation. He began his career in political journalism in earnest at this point. By his own count, 40 articles appeared in his Le Correspondant Picard, inspiring no less than 200 lawsuits against him, at least one of which was probably a criminal matter, because we know he was in jail on the anniversary of the Bastille's fall for pissing off the wrong people. After his release, he was pleased to take a job away from the city he was in as an archivist and administrator in the Department of the Somme, as his career as a specialist in land rights and feudal privileges was now definitely dead, and his career as a political journalist definitely not paying the bills. However, rivalry with another man at this post became a quarrel, and he was forced to leave soon after he obtained a similar job in yet another district, Montdidier. Unfortunately for him, the president of this district was an ultra-royalist and aristocrat who developed an intense dislike of this too clever by half up-jumped son of an Austrian, and accused him of forgery on the bills of sale for national lands, with the wrong name appearing in the wrong place at Babeuf's hand. Now, if a mistake was actually made, it is doubtless that it was just that, a mistake. Babeuf's whole family really could have used the money from such an impressive scheme if it occurred. They were so fucking poor. But Babeuf was nonetheless arrested for this, and his ass was about to be railroaded in court. Well, they would railroad his ass in court, but they would do it without his ass around. Babeuf would seize an opportunity to escape when it presented itself and fled to Paris, probably aware that he was never going to get a fair trial for this, where he was. In August 1793, he was sentenced to 20 years of penal servitude for this quote-unquote crime. His wife was forced to part with her furniture when finally confronted by angry creditors before joining her husband in Paris, their children in tow. In July of 1794, his honor was finally rehabilitated when a criminal tribunal unanimously declared that there was no case on which to prosecute François Babeuf. In fact, the whole case was likely a frame-up from the word go, a conspiracy involving the nobility generally interested in mucking up any effort of the nation to profit from new national land sales, and other nobles more specifically opposed to Babeuf personally and his revolutionary spirit. After this trial, if you'll recall from your history, in July of 1794, Maximilien Robespierre is the last remaining strongman at the helm of the so-called Reign of Terror, and he is not long for this world. Because nothing brings people together and focuses their minds like the possibility of death. So when Robespierre revealed to the convention evidence of yet more conspiracies, strongly intimating that some of the plotters could hear his voice even then in the hall, he signed his own death warrant. Meanwhile, Babeuf set up yet another paper, his Journal de la Liberté de la Presse, and began mercilessly attacking the Reign of Terror, before turning to attack what historians call the Thermidorian reaction that came to be in charge of the Directorate, with no less vigor. In fact, it took him only 2 months for him to become sufficiently annoying to those Thermidorians that they attempted to seize both him and his paper, but Babeuf was too quick for them. Not only did he get away, but he started another paper from his new hideaway, different in title, identical in content. He will eventually become a bit more circumspect on Robespierre, attacking his reign of terror, but saying, quote, "Let us distinguish between Robespierre, the apostle of liberty, and Robespierre, the most infamous of tyrants," end quote. Now, of course, you and I know no one's luck lasts forever. So in February 1795, the police finally got their hands on Babeuf. At this point in French history, almost totally gone were the arbitrary executions without trial of the Reign of Terror, replaced instead, in Babeuf's and others' cases, with imprisonment of an arbitrary and amorphous nature, with no charges filed and no trials even entertained in thought, let alone come close to being held. While in prison, he appears to have read a book that was once in vogue, whose author has grown almost unbelievably obscure to us today, a man named Morley, on what we might call utopian socialism, and which provided yet more fuel for Babeuf's burgeoning communism, as he watched the First French Republic devolve into a scramble to create a new aristocracy, not of blood, but of wealth. In the words of a historian far superior to me, Ernest Belfort Bax, quote, "It was indeed evident that all these nouveaux riches, thieves on a great scale, constituted the real and sole effective power in the country. Their 5 directors were their mandatories." The Directory and all the prominent politicians of the time were hand in glove with a clique of speculative financiers, whose sole aim was to enrich themselves. Their nefarious influence may be seen in most of the laws passed, and it is indeed traceable right up to the year 1814. The bulk of the governing classes under Barras, Bonaparte, the Bourbons were dominated by, or were in league with, this band of robbers, who systematically exploited the national wealth for their own benefit. These financial jackals seized upon everything they could lay their hands on, it mattered not what: church revenues, fiscal moneys, feudal estates. The result, naturally, was the sudden and rapid growth of a propertyless proletariat. Such was the state of things which confronted Babeuf when his political career began, and such was the population to whom the gospel of Babeuf appeared as a godsend. Thousands of persons in Paris and in other towns of France were on the brink of starvation. The economic situation in Paris under the Directory and the subsequent years was as desperate as any that has been known in the world's history. End quote. And what's more, the Reign of Terror had given way to a white terror. Gangs of men now roamed Paris, dedicated to rooting out the remnants of Jacobinism and leftism generally. And the constitution produced for France during this time repealed universal suffrage and reimposed high property qualifications on participation in government. As this happened, Babeuf grew in popularity, as the Directory mostly left him alone for a bit, busy as it was at the moment dealing with insurrection based in its right flank, and needing the remaining unsuppressed Jacobins' assistance in quelling these royalist uprisings. But Babeuf's thought and energy was beginning to occupy a space of attraction, in the vacuum being left by the repression of the left. He formed something called the Society of the Pantheon, originally holding meetings by torchlight in basements, and already beginning to split into a right wing dedicated to the Revolution of 1789 and political equality, and perhaps obtaining a place for themselves and their associates in such an order, and a left dominated by Babeuf, dedicated to absolute equality, both social and political, and less interested in finding slots for themselves than in ripping the whole crooked edifice down. By February of 1796, Babeuf had emerged as the dominant voice of the society in all wings, most reactionaries and doubtful moderates having departed, but unfortunately they were now also infiltrated by agents of the police, as the government became increasingly worried about the growing energy of this left movement that held private property as the root of, well, if not all evil, most of it. In fact, it was a young former junior artillery officer, now made a general at the age of 24, named Napoleon Bonaparte, who showed up to bust the club and arrest Babeuf yet again before March arrived. In fact, before long, the entire society was likely to be either in chains, executed, or dispersed. And so but one course was left to them, they thought, the formation of a secret, small revolutionary vanguard ready to seize power, dissolve the hated Constitution of 95, and start redistributing property. A manifesto was drafted. Obviously, every real revolutionary needs one of these. And though it was not meant to be taken as a document of absolute agreement among the members of what I will call the secret directory, it came pretty close, and it's not too long. I will quote a bit from it now. Quote, "The people have marched over the bodies of kings and priests who coalesced against it. It will be the same with the new tyrants, with the new political hypocrites seated in the place of the old ones. What do we want more than equality of rights? We want not only the equality transcribed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, we will have it in the midst of us, under the roof of our houses. We consent to everything for its sake, to make a clear board, that we may hold to it alone. Perish, if must be, all the arts, provided real equality be left us. Legislators and governors who have neither genius nor good faith, rich proprietors without bowels of compassion, you will try in vain to neutralize our holy enterprise by saying that it does no more than reproduce that agrarian law already demanded more than once before. Calumniators, be silent in your turn, and in the silence of confusion listen to our demands, dictated by nature and based upon justice." The agrarian law, or the partition of lands, was the immediate aim of certain soldiers without principles, of certain peoples moved by their instinct rather than by reason. We aim at something more sublime and more equitable, the common good, or the community of goods. No more individual property in the land. The land belongs to no one. We demand, we would have, the communal enjoyment of the fruits of the earth, fruits which are for everyone. We declare that we can no longer suffer with the enormous majority of men, labor and sweat in the service and for the good pleasure of a small minority. Enough and too long have less than 1 million of individuals disposed of that which belongs to more than 20 millions of their kind. Let this great scandal that our grandchildren will hardly be willing to believe in cease. Let us disappear once for all the revolting distinction of rich and poor, of great and small, of masters and valets, of governors and governed. Let there be no difference between human beings than those of age and sex. Since all have the same needs and the same faculties, let there be one education for all, one food for all. We are contented with one son and one heir for all. Why should the same portion and the same quality of nourishment not suffice for each of us. But already the enemies of an order of things the most natural that can be imagined declaim against us. Disorganizers and factious persons, they say. You only seek massacre and plunder. People of France, we shall not waste our tune in replying to them, but we shall tell you, the holy enterprise which we organize has no other aim than to put an end to civil dissensions and to the public misery. End quote. A 15-point plan by Babeuf and his supporters, more concrete and less rhetorical than what I read, would follow, but by now you're hopefully starting to get an idea of what these cats were all about. Their rallying cry would be mostly a restoration of the old constitution, which was itself recognized by them to be flawed and insufficient, confirming as it does the right of private property for one thing, but was nonetheless the rallying cry for Babeuf's folk, for the remnants of the Robespierreites and Jacobins, for all the scattered and half-suppressed members of the left in France. By May of 1796, their propaganda was beginning to bear fruit, and Babeuf was now more than any other person the leader responsible for the whole of the left insurrectionist movement in France at the time. They began working to cultivate relationships and sympathy in the army in preparation for the seizing of power, and began to attract sympathy from more moderate elements of the National Assembly. Afraid of both turning these men away and of following their lead, Babeuf and his lieutenants would work to tamp down any attempt by these committee men to start their own movements, but also warn the government not to attempt to lay hands on them, who, whatever their flaws, had indeed suffered for democracy. You ever see that meme that says liberals hate socialists more than fascists? Well, it may not be universally true, and fascists and socialists didn't really exist at the time, but I couldn't help but recall it, because these radical Democrats were now viewed as so menacing that royalist and liberal alike would bury their hatchets. And the directorate spin around from its right to its left flank and began clobbering the shit out of Babeuf's society. Now came the call, as an American might put it, to live free or die trying. Their intention was to destroy the existing government, to call the people of Paris together in General Assembly, for the secret directory to give an account of its actions in insurrection, and call upon the Assembly to ratify that insurrection, after which the provisional government should be nominated by the Committee for the Approval of the Assembly. Feelers into the military and police forces of France began to show signs of having influence, and leaders of Babeuf's conspiracy of equals were beginning to fear additional delay. Well, just as they were beginning to fear additional delay, they were betrayed. Spies weren't just present at their general meetings, but sat in chairs within the innermost circles of planning, and thus Babeuf found himself arrested for the last time on May 10th, 1797, along with many of his associates. 16 days later, he was sentenced to death. He tried to rob the executioner's labor with a homemade dagger, but his courtroom suicide attempt failed, and he was guillotined the following day with a courage that even his enemies had to admit was impressive, and his body dumped into a mass grave. As an aside, the man who betrayed the conspiracy of equals, called Grizel, would meet a violent end as well. He was later in Spain, along with Émile Babeuf, son of Francois. They were fighting for Spanish independence, and Émile, happening to hear that the man who had betrayed his father was near, sought him out and challenged him to a duel. No namby-pamby duel for honor or to first blood, but a duel to the death. He won. Quote, I gave words to these feelings in my tribune of the people. I said to everyone, listen. Those among you who have apparently come around to feeling as a result of the long series of public calamities that the republic is worthless and that the monarchy might be preferable, you people are right, I swear it. I spelled it out in capital letters. We were better off under the kings than we are under the republic. But you must understand which republic I mean by that. A republic such as the one we see is totally worthless, without a doubt. But this, my friends, is not the true republic. The true republic is something that you do not yet even know about. All right, then, if you wish, I will try to tell you something about it. And I am almost certain that you will idolize it. The republic is not a word, not even several words, empty of meaning. The words liberty and equality, which have continuously resounded in your ears, cast a spell over you in the early days of the Revolution, because you thought that they would signify something good for the people. Now they mean nothing to you at all, because you see that they are only vain articulations and ornaments of deceitful formulas. You must be made to learn that in spite of all this, they can and must signify a good that is precious for the greatest number. End quote. So Babeuf would remark, among other things, in his trials speech. But for us, so ends the tale of the world's first real revolutionary communist. The first one with definite plans for change and the seizing of the levers of power. For me, Babeuf is fascinating. He reminds me of the Big Bill Haywood quote. I've never read Marxist Capital, but I've got the marks of capital all over me. Because with all due respect to any socialists whose paths lay within the words of men and women endlessly describing natural laws, political philosophy, and material conditions, there is another path. For the sufficiently curious and sensitive, extended intimate contact with a system dedicated to grinding up masses of people for arbitrary reasons of hierarchy and profit can be enough alone to drive at least one person to grasp towards another way. How many Babeufs now walk unknown amongst us in the drive-through windows of fast food restaurants, or stocking the shelves of Walmarts, or on hold with their health insurance companies, all becoming equally curious about what true social and political egalitarianism would look like in a real republic of equality. They need not all head vanguard parties or hatch conspiracies to change the world. And who can blame them if they, or we, perhaps, are somewhat inconsistent over time, just as Babeuf's political writings were. For as one Frenchman with one pimp-ass hat and a funny name once put it, quote, "The Republican is not the man of eternity. He is the man of time. His paradise is the earth. He wants to enjoy freedom and happiness there, and to enjoy them while he is there, without waiting." End quote. Thank you for listening. Next time, I promise, we'll go back to America. Till then, au revoir.